Since its introduction to the game, Xeno Compatibility has been the most divisive extension perk in Stellaris. Xenophile players love it for the powerful in-game population boost it can give their empire, while others mock it for the unwanted implications and fetishism that tends to crop up around such topics in online forums. But Xeno Compatibility even possible? Might we someday meet and crossbreed with an alien species? How would that work? Today on Science and Stellaris, Xeno Compatibility. In the far distant future, you end up at a wild bender, where young Ratchet Trader impresses you with their gallant tales of wandering the cosmos and their shiny ocular organs. One thing leads to another, and you end the night in passionate coitus. A few weeks later, you discover that young Ratchet has left something behind. A litter of half-human hybrids is gestating in your womb. Naturally gifted with the psychic abilities of the Ratchet, your litter has already begun to telepathically bond with you. Your liminal dreams are filled with their sensation of anticipation as you look forward to being born. The idea of a half-human, half-alien offspring has been a common trope in science fiction ever since writers began to imagine that planets beyond the Earth might be teeming with alien civilizations. Many of sci-fi's most famous characters are presented as hybrids. Spock, Peter Quill, who you might know as Star-Lord, Barf the Mog, and Steven Universe are notable examples. Despite the apparent ease with which fictional characters produce viable offspring, hybridization across species can be an inherently risky and difficult way to reproduce, though there are a few advantages that hybrids might gain over their non-hybrid parents. An obvious disadvantage is that most hybrids are sterile, or their children will be born sterile. Mules, the hybrid of a mare and a jack, aka a male donkey, are the most famous examples of hybrid sterility. Incidentally, the hybrid of a stallion and a jenny, a female donkey, is called a hinny and is even more difficult to produce than a mule, due to differences in the size of the womb of a donkey and a horse, causing epigenetic inheritance issues for hinnies. More on this in a moment. Mule infertility is caused by issues with meiosis. During meiosis, the special form of cellular division that forms gametes, or egg and sperm cells, a process called genetic recombination occurs. Basically, the cell cuts up its own chromosome into smaller packets, then swaps those packets with its homologous pair, the other half of the chromosome that mirrors it. Genetic recombination is why you look somewhat like your parents, but aren't their exact clones. It allows for variety and diversity in the genetics of an egg or sperm cell to occur. But for mules, that process does not work, because half of the mule's cells' chromosomes are horse and half are donkey. Since horses have 64 chromosomes and donkeys have 62, their homologous pairs do not exactly match up during genetic recombination. So instead of swapping, say, the chromosomal sequence that codes for eyes with a homologous pair that also codes for eyes, you instead swap the sequence for eyes with one for tongues, and the horrific offspring that results ends up growing tongues where its eyes should be. At least it would, if the fetus didn't simply die before becoming a viable life form. This hybrid problem is worsened by epigenetics. Growing embryos don't just need their own genetics to be correctly sorted to be viable, they also take in chemical cues from their surroundings in the form of nutrition and hormones. These external factors that influence the growth of an organism are called epigenetics, and they can have an enormous influence on what the young embryo will eventually become. For example, dogs and wolves are genetically the same species, but thanks to differences in epigenetic triggers, a dog can take such different forms as a pug or a Great Dane. They are all the same species despite such variety of forms, all thanks to epigenetic differences. And for hybrids, which already have troubles due to odd chromosome sequences, epigenetics can play a huge role in whether a hybrid comes to term. That is why there are many mules in the world, but very few hinnies. Epigenetics makes it very difficult for a hinny embryo to grow and develop without being miscarried. I mentioned that hybrids might have some advantages over their non-hybrid relatives, and that is true for some organisms. Take plants, for example. Because plants do not have properly defined organs and their bodies are asymmetrical, plant hybrids are more likely to survive. A plant isn't as likely to be stillborn if, say, it grows leaves in odd places on its stem, or produces double the flowers that its parents did. And even if the hybrid plant is sterile and unable to produce viable gametes, it can still spread itself vegetatively. One advantage of plants over animals is that they can reproduce both sexually and asexually through budding, allowing sterile hybrids, like seedless bananas, to still reproduce. Since hybridization is not as lethal for plants, some hybrids end up becoming hardier and more adaptive than their two parents, as they inherit the traits of both. The term heterosis, or hybrid vigor, describes situations where a hybrid might have better fitness than either of its parents, because its wider variety of given genetic traits make it more adaptable to fluctuations in the environment. For example, a blight or other disease might be deadly to either or both parents, but the combined traits of the two provide some level of immunity to their hybrid offspring. We see such drama play out in many cultivars of domesticated plant. The potato blight that once devastated Ireland is partly combated today with the use of hybrid cultivars that are more resistant to the disease than either of their parents. Heterosis isn't exactly guaranteed, though. Sometimes a hybrid acquires additional negative traits from both of its parents. We see heterosis represented in Stellaris, with hybrid species gaining additional gene points and a mixture of both of their parents' genetic traits, but only the positive aspects of hybridization are presented and not the negatives. Another problem for Xeno Compatibility, as is depicted in Stellaris, is the concept of chirality. Chirality, or handedness, describes the fact that almost all proteins can be folded in two ways, with folds being mirror images of one another. And proteins that are folded the wrong way cannot serve their original function in a cell. If a cell began to produce too many proteins with the wrong chirality, it would eventually die from lack of the correct protein. There are billions of potential proteins in the universe, and that means that the odds that an alien organism would happen to share the same chirality on all of them as the ones used by Earth's life forms is mathematically impossible. And that alone dooms the idea that a hybrid cell with genetics from an alien and a human would be viable. Forget the chromosome count, the genetics itself would be coding for tons of proteins with misaligned chirality. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We are only speaking about proteins and haven't considered alternatives like life that's based on arsenic bonds rather than phosphorus bonds, or life forms that rely on ammonia as a universal solvent rather than water. Merely touching an alien might be lethal if their biochemistry is based on toxic compounds, let alone trying to produce a baby with it. Does that mean that xenocompatibility is impossible? That our dreams of making it with beautiful alien sphinxes doomed from the start? There may be another way. Hybridization is not the only means of producing an adult organism with a genetic heritage of two different species. Another strategy would be to make a human xenochimera, an organism with two separate cellular lineages that have grown into one being. Genetic chimeraism, though rare in nature, can be induced in the lab using a technique known as ablation. During ablation, a zygote has some of its stem cells stripped, then replaced with viable cells from a different germline, a process known as embryonic transplantation. The resulting artificial chimera can have features from both the original zygote and the introduced one. For example, an artificial chimera that has the features of both a chick and a quail was created using this technique. Provided that the alien and the human parents have organ systems that are rough cognates to one another, and that individual cells can be targeted in the embryonic stages of development for ablation and transplantation, it might be possible to produce a human-alien genetic chimera. The resulting chimera would share some features of both parents, like a hybrid, but unlike a true hybrid, it wouldn't risk the genetic diseases that odd chromosome counts can cause. Such a chimera would even produce viable gametes, but only for whichever phenotype ended up producing its sexual organs. If the top half of a human xenochimera were human, and the bottom half xeno, then the children made by the chimera would be fully xeno. Ultimately, it's impossible to say just how far genetic engineering will advance in the future, and what might be possible to future civilizations. Perhaps the biochemistry issues won't be nearly as impossible as they currently seem. Arsenic biochemistry is an emerging field, as is the creation of synthetic life forms with fully novel and engineered metabolisms. In the future, we may be able to guide genetic recombination to prevent the sterility we normally see in hybrids, and designer genetics might let us create novel forms of life that incorporate the genome of multiple species safely. I wouldn't bet against new methods being discovered that could potentially overcome the current difficulties that prevent xenocompatibility of some form, whether a true genetic hybrid or a carefully constructed chimera, from being possible. The real question is just how much we want this technology. An open, xenophilic society might place a high priority on reproductive freedom and duly develop the technology to enable it. Culturally, future societies would have to overcome some basic, primal fears, especially the fear of amalgamation, to reach this point. In the past, many human societies became obsessed with maintaining genetic purity, declaring exogamy, marrying outside of a perceived in-group, a crime, or embracing the ideology of eugenics. Such systems arose both to justify imposed social hierarchies and because of rulers willing to exaggerate the differences between phenotypes to gain a following and power. And sadly, such darkness might one day return to menace our civilization. This fear of the other, at least in part, has evolved because of the risk of hybridization. Most hybrids are sterile, and thus evolutionarily dead ends. And putting in the effort to raise such young risk the continuation of the parents' genetic lineages. It is likely that most alien species will share this instinct, as there is a strong and likely universal selective pressure against mating outside one species. Even if technology might one day overcome the inherent risk of hybridization, it may take longer for society to overcome its innate bias against it. Only time will tell.